webinar introducing Viva Health Laboratories. We're thrilled to have the Senior Scientific Lead, Mark Howard, presenting for us this evening. But before we begin, kindly ask that you keep your cameras and mics off for the duration of the presentation. The Q&A feature is available, and I encourage you to type your questions throughout the presentation, and these will be answered in our live Q&A. During this time, if you wish to ask a question, please do raise your hand and one of us will call on you. If you experience any issues throughout the webinar, please pop a message in and I'll make sure to rectify it promptly. Without further ado, I will hand over to Mark Howard from Viva Health Laboratories.
Great. Thank you, Megan. I'm Mark Howard from Viva Health Laboratories. Here we go. So what I'm going to talk about today is give you an introduction to nutritional and environmental medicine, explain what purpose it serves, and to look at some of the laboratory tests of nutritional status and how we assess environmental exposures, and how all of this benefits patients, which of course is the most important thing. So formerly, I worked at a lab called Biolab. Ever since I first started working in laboratory medicine, I've always worked. I was fortunate enough for my first job to be in a biochemistry lab that specialised in nutritional screening. So my whole working life has been really devoted to nutritional medicine. I've been involved in quite a lot of research over the years, published quite a few papers. And I continue to work with research colleagues and follow the developments in nutrition and environmental medicine as closely as I can. And VHL asked me last year to lead the way in developing and promoting the nutrition environmental test that they're offering. So Viva Health Labs is a standard, it's conventional medical laboratory. Offering a very comprehensive panels of tests that would be available to most GPs. It's replicating what a lot of NHS labs do. But we also provide tests for functional medicine. So that's really looking at the role of nutrition and the environment in health and disease, and how the influence of the 21st century affects health. This involves looking at minerals, vitamins, looking at gut function, looking at allergy tests and food intolerance testing, but also looking at some of the things in the environment that are detrimental to health, such as toxic metals and chemicals. And what I'll be doing later on in this presentation, I'll show you some of the quite unique tests that are available. So what is nutritional and environmental medicine? It's the assessment of the impact of all aspects of an individual's environment on their health and well-being. And that involves using conventional hospital laboratory tests, as well as the more specialised tests. General medicine, unfortunately, all too frequently doesn't consider the hugely detrimental effects of suboptimal diets and lifestyle factors on patients', not just their symptoms, but also the influence these factors can have on their recovery and their future well-being. Practitioners and the general public have a much greater awareness nowadays of lifestyle factors on health and disease. We've really seen this come along enormously in the last 10 to 15 years, and it's great to see. So nutritional medicine is the practice of incorporating nutritional screening, patients' assessments, and correcting nutritional deficiencies and optimizing their nutrition, which involves looking at minerals, vitamins, fatty acids, to improve their overall health and well-being. And there can be some quite remarkable success stories using this approach. In terms of justifying why we do this, there's the Department of Health and Social Care and the Food Standards Agency 10 or 15 years ago set up national diet and nutrition surveys where they assess the intake of food and the nutritional status by measuring blood levels of a randomized group of the UK population. And they look at babies, also they look at infants, children, adolescents, adults, and the elderly. And they do quite an in-depth study of their nutritional status, and I'll talk about that in a little while. But it does demonstrate that there's a significant rate of inadequate nutrition in the UK. which probably doesn't come as a surprise to many of us. Many diseases are associated with poor diet and lifestyle choices, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The NHS is limited in what it can screen for in terms of assessing nutritional status of patients. And I've added in there, but rather sarcastically, that hospital food doesn't necessarily help the acutely ill. It's difficult to assess diet and nutritional status accurately without testing, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. And you get better patient compliance with laboratory results. Telling somebody that their diet probably isn't helping them to attain adequate levels of minerals and vitamins isn't as convincing as showing the patient a hard copy report which demonstrates that they've got definite deficiencies. And it's also important that levels are monitored following diagnosis of deficiencies and during nutritional supplementation programs, because it's very easy using nutritional supplements which may have significantly greater quantities of nutrients in them than you would get from the diet. It's very easy for patients to actually overdose on these and to end up with higher levels than you would anticipate. So why is diet so important? Well, we are what we eat. And I like to use this example of planting some tomato seeds in some soil in the garden. And depending on the quality of that soil and whether you feed it and how well it's watered, that alone will determine how well the tomato plant turns out. It needs sunlight as well, as do humans. So what those seeds are doing is taking up nutrients from the soil and basically converting them into this beautiful tomato plant. So we really are what we eat, and it applies to the whole plant and animal kingdom. It's exactly the same in principles of human health. In times of famine, children are shown not to grow as tall. We eat a lot of ultra processed food now as a nation, and this is the quality of some of this ultra processed food is absolutely terrible. It's very often leftovers from other food production. There's been a massive loss of essential micronutrients during the processing of this food. They have additional unnecessary nutrients like sodium and potassium and hydrogenated fats and flavorings and stability agents and so forth. And other chemicals that just aren't needed. They don't serve any purpose in our nutrition, and they're just a challenge to the body to metabolize them. And of course, if people are eating highly processed foods, they're not filling themselves up then on fresh, healthier foods. We're recommended to have a minimum daily intake of 5 portions of fresh fruit and vegetables a day. And as a nation, only about a quarter of adults and less than 10% of children actually consume this minimum. So that's the absolute minimum. Ideally, it should be many more than that, and it should be as varied as possible. Some countries now say a minimum of 7 or 8 portions of fresh fruit and vegetables. There's an increasing trend towards to becoming vegans and vegetarians, and they don't necessarily benefit from all of the nutrients that would be acquired from consuming meat and fish. So there's an extra risk of nutritional deficiencies for some of these vegetarians and vegans. Inappropriate use of nutritional supplements. Some people, it's estimated 50% of the UK public are using nutritional supplements. Actually, most of them would do better just to improve their dietary choices. There's several things that can go wrong with consuming supplements. You can over supplement. You can take supplements you don't need, so you're increasing the dosage of micronutrients that you need. Whole food contains many of these vitamins and minerals. And in combination with the protein and the enzymes in the food, it's a much more nutritious way of taking in the micronutrients. And also, if people are taking supplements, they're more likely then to think, oh, I don't have to worry about eating as well because I'm getting my vitamins and minerals every day. So there's all sorts of reasons why inappropriate use of nutritional supplements is not advisable. There's malabsorption amongst a subset of the UK population because of poor gut health. So gut infections, we know, millions of people in the UK reported having IBS, but high alcohol intake and exposure to other toxins Some gut allergies, things like celiac disease and lactose intolerance can all harm the gut's wall and damage its ability to absorb micronutrients. So you can end up with a malabsorption situation. A large, well, I've said there up to 50% of Western populations believe they have a food allergy, and actually most of them are wrong. Some of these food allergies may be food intolerances rather than allergies, but people have a hunch that they're allergic to something and they just withdraw it from their diet, and that's restricting their dietary intake, which can also be harmful. And the development of deficiencies doesn't just occur over a few weeks. They can develop very slowly over many years. And very often, some of the levels we see, it would be quite difficult to replete the levels simply with food. So sometimes targeted nutritional therapy with nutritional supplements is the only way you're going to reverse some of these deficiencies. But having reversed that, the supplementation should be scaled off, and hopefully dietary intake or repairing the gut or addressing the issues that led to the deficiency in the first place can help to prevent a deficiency developing again. So National Diet and Nutrition Surveys, this is looking at the general population, and they exclude sick people. So they're generally looking at healthy people. There's a very, very brief summary here. You can access all of the NDNS reports. If you just Google NDNS, you'll find the most recent reports, and they provide some summary documents, which are a little easier to use. But in the most recent reports, which go back a few years now, suggests that the use of sugary drinks is slowly decreasing, which is great. But there's still very high intake of free sugar, confectionery, and saturated fats in all age groups. The mean fibre intake is well below recommendations in all age groups. In terms of vitamins and minerals, there's continued evidence of low vitamin A intake. Vitamin D levels are low, low red cell folates. Rather worryingly, 89% of women with childbearing age had lower than recommended red cell folates. I know that most pregnant women are recommended to take folic acid as soon as they become pregnant, or even when they're planning a pregnancy, but that's quite a worrying statistic. 25% of women have low iron intake. A fifth of women have low levels of iodine, and so on. Children and the elderly frequently have lower intakes and lower blood levels for many nutrients. Vitamin D, you're probably all familiar with, but there is widespread deficiency amongst the UK population. I'm not quite sure how NDNS allow for this. If you measure vitamin D at different times of the year, you're obviously going to get different levels. So a borderline level in the spring is probably nothing unduly to worry about, but a borderline level at the end of the summer, when we're not going to have any more sunlight exposure for 6 months, it would be of greater concern. And that sort of thing applies to all sorts of micronutrients. There are other factors that influence an individual's requirements. Vitamin B2, it's in our laboratory. Vitamin B2 which is riboflavin, is the vitamin where we see the B vitamin where we see the highest rate of deficiencies, and NDNS report that about half of adults in the UK are deficient. And they've now excluded some of the micronutrients they used to measure because, as they say, there's previously been little evidence of nutritional deficiencies, which is a little worrying, because what happens in the future, they don't know if these will start to be a problem in the future, because we won't be looking at it. It's also, interestingly for me, I'm particularly interested in toxic metals. In earlier studies, they reported that mercury levels were shown to increase with age, which suggests that people are exceeding their excretory capacity over a lifetime. And I've been involved in some research which has shown that that's also the.
Sorry, Mark, I think you've muted yourself.
Yes, sorry, I moved a window, and I think I must have hit the mute button. To me, this chart really demonstrates why nutritional medicine is important. If you imagine any disease, really, the chances of acquiring it in childhood is really quite low. So if you take a smoker, for example, as an extreme example, if a kid starts smoking when they're 10 years old, they're unlikely to get lung cancer in their teens or in their 20s. It's something that will develop over many years of exposure. And it's the same with many of the nasty diseases we face nowadays. As we age, our risk increases. And that can be partly because we all have a threshold where we'll experience symptoms of a particular disease once we cross that threshold. And you can increase the threshold by being fit and healthy and exercising regularly and minimizing your exposure to chemicals and other toxins, and of course eating healthily. So in terms of boosting vitamin and mineral levels and fatty acids and so forth, there's plenty of evidence now that shows good nutritional status does reduce the risk of serious disease. And I think this chart demonstrates how that adaptive capacity for an individual can be increased. So all sorts of challenges to us can reduce the adaptive capacity. And of course, some challenges enable us to strengthen. So physical exertion actually increases our resilience. And as people age, all of these factors kind of decrease, and so the symptom threshold is that much lower, and individuals are more likely to suffer disease. So the whole approach of nutritional medicine is trying to increase an individual's adaptive capacity. In terms of associations of nutritional and environmental factors with leading causes of death, I've just listed a few here, which you'll probably all be familiar with. Dementia, there's really good links now to dietary influences on the risk of or increasing risk of dementia. B vitamin intake and fish oils are starting to look as if they may have an influence on not just the rate of progression of disease, but also the age at which you're likely to be affected. And of course, dementia is one thing where if you can slow down the rate of progression, then elderly people can continue to live a relatively normal life. But if we can decrease the risk with diet, then all the better. And I think there'll be a lot of research out about this in the coming years. Heart disease is obviously associated with smoking and lack of exercise and poor diets. Respiratory diseases actually account for a very high number of deaths, certainly in the top 5 or 6, I think, and smoking, obesity play a part in that. And anything that can reduce the risk of infections and enable the body to fight infections better, so enhancing nutritional status can be helpful. Cerebrovascular disease, increased fiber intake, boosting the microbiome has been shown to influence brain health. B vitamins, magnesium. Magnesium is a fascinating mineral, and I'll talk a little bit about it a little bit more in a while. But adequate magnesium status enables the blood vessels to expand and contract that much better, and hence provide better blood supply to the brain. Cancers, we know that diets high in ultra processed foods can increase cancer risk. Obesity increases cancer risk, and that's normally related to poor diets or poor dietary choices. Smoking and other chemical exposures also increase the risk. So there's all sorts of nutritional and environmental factors that can help to reduce cancer risk. And in general, obtaining micronutrients from the diet is more beneficial than from supplements. Just emphasize that again. You have better food choices, fewer peaks and troughs in the levels, and you then get less competitive absorption between various micronutrients, more fiber, and of course the food's it's more enjoyable to eat food than it is to eat supplements. Looking a little bit further at why we need minerals and vitamins, they are the building blocks of biochemistry. They're essential micronutrients. Mammals that have any of the minerals and vitamins I'm talking about today deprived from their diet will eventually, their function will fail, and it will eventually lead to death, which is the definition of essentiality. There's many vitamins and minerals. I'm just picking a few here where we see the most deficiencies. Zinc is utilized by about 100 different enzymes. It's required for the creation of DNA, cell growth, building proteins, so growth and wound healing, and developing. Zinc deficiency has some quite distinct features, which I'll cover in minutes. Magnesium is a cofactor in more than 300 enzymes. It supports muscle health, nerve function, and energy production. Iodine is primarily taken up by the thyroid gland, and it's an atom that's on the thyroxine molecule. It's an important antioxidant, and it appears that it has some role in cancer prevention. The B vitamins are required by over 100 different enzymes. Antioxidants, which are in fresh fruit and vegetables, and various minerals and vitamins, they eliminate free radicals and reduce oxidation damage to oxidative damage from toxin exposure. Vitamin E is an important antioxidant. It's essential for immunity, improves kidney function, cell signaling, and regulation of gene expression, and so on. Omega-3, the polyunsaturated fatty acids, are associated with all sorts of health benefits. If anybody would like any more specific information on these, because I haven't got much time now, I'm kind of racing through, my email address is at the end. Do drop me an email. I can provide you with a lot more information on signs and symptoms. I feel like a salesman when I say this, that for a lot of these minerals and vitamins, there aren't any obvious signs and symptoms of marginal deficiencies. And the only way to really tell is to test. And we've built together a number of profiles so you can look specifically at a group of minerals or a group of vitamins. But just to summarize a few of the more common signs and symptoms that you might detect with iron deficiency, they can be fatigue and weakness, and eventually dizziness and poor immunity. Vitamin D deficiency is very common. It can lead to poor bone health, but it's also been associated with cancer risk and mental health problems. Again, it's not something you can look at somebody and say you're vitamin D deficient. You really do need to test, and it's an inexpensive test. White spots on the fingernails are quite a clear indicator of zinc deficiency, which affects immunity and growth and wound healing. But it also sometimes is accompanied by a poor sense of taste and smell. Poor wound healing may be indicative of a zinc deficiency. Muscle cramps and twitches, it can sometimes be magnesium deficiency. Magnesium is required by muscles to help them relax. So people who experience night cramps in their legs, which is that very large muscles in their legs cramp, it's very often to do with magnesium status. In the long term, it increases the risk of hypertension and cardiovascular disease. Chromium is required for normal glucose tolerance, and I think that anybody who's diagnosed as type 2 diabetic should be screened for their chromium level and perhaps given a chromium supplement, which should, in many cases, will help their glucose tolerance. And we know that type 2 diabetes is a reversible disease for many patients, ultimately just using diet. And so there's a few others there. People who drink alcohol regularly should be considered vulnerable to B vitamin deficiencies. Vitamin B1 is one of the primary, in fact, alcoholics who are admitted to hospital are normally just given thiamine, just on the assumption that they'll be B1 deficient. And all of this is covered in books about nutritional medicine and micronutrient status. In terms of our laboratory findings, the most frequent abnormal findings we see are zinc and magnesium deficiencies, iodine deficiency, B vitamins, lutein and other antioxidant deficiencies. So that's vitamin E, sometimes vitamin A. Lutein is an antioxidant that's found in fresh vegetables. And lycopene, another antioxidant which we can measure, is found in the colourful fruit. So actually measuring lutein and lycopene can be a helpful way to see if someone is eating enough fresh fruit and veg. Vitamin E deficiencies, we see quite a lot of vitamin E deficiency and there are different isomers of vitamin E, and we're able to report most of them, so you can actually see which parts of the vitamin E vitamin people are not or need supplementing with. Vitamin D deficiency and the seasonal variations. We see lots of omega-6, raised omega-6 to omega-3 ratios. If people should be eating more seafood, really, which is high in the important omega-3 fatty acids. If they have a high intake of omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, so some from meats and some other things, then that can be detrimental to health, and ideally they should be eating more omega-3 fatty acids. We see lots of raised toxic metals, which is quite unusual. Most of us don't have direct exposure to mines and industry nowadays, but there are lots of environmental sources, background environmental sources of toxic metals. People of certain generations still have mercury amalgam fillings. Up until the 1980s and 90s, there was still a lot of lead in the atmosphere from combustion engines, leaded fuel, and all of that lead is still in the atmosphere. It hasn't been buried back in the ground. It's just settled in the dust, and it's still circulating. And we're into people who do eat fish regularly. Some of the larger fish accumulate mercury and arsenic and some other metals. So regular fish eaters can be susceptible to increasing their overall toxic metal levels, which is really unfortunate. It's contamination of a really nice food source. We also do a lot of intestinal bacterial screening and a SIBO test, which I'll talk about later. But we see a lot of patients who have disturbed microflora in the gut. We don't do all of the testing here. We send out a number of tests, and we use accredited labs. So they're all reputable labs. Some of them are world experts in what they're doing, and the technology just isn't available in the UK. So we use some European labs and some American labs. And we're not hiding that on our reports. It's always very clear which lab has actually performed the test. And we've tried to make ourselves a one-stop shop for nutrition and environmental screening. So most of the tests that practitioners would require will be available here. So conventional pathology tests of nutritional status, the sort of thing a GP can look at, would include vitamin B12 and folate, vitamin D levels, some of the minerals, but there are many others, some of which I've already discussed, where there's proven essentiality, but also where there are very frequent dietary insufficiencies and deficiencies. So vitamin D, I'm just going to use this as an example, really. Vitamin D is something that we were looking at in nutritional medicine labs in the 70s and 80s, and we became aware that there was actually a nationwide problem with vitamin D deficiency. But it wasn't widely appreciated until the late 1990s. And now it's a test that every GP is very familiar with. And in vulnerable individuals, so those with dark skin or people who aren't getting much natural sunlight, doctors will routinely screen them for their vitamin D level. And it's very simple blood test and relatively inexpensive nowadays. But we believe that other essential minerals and vitamins should also be just as important and should also be screened for. As I mentioned, zinc, magnesium, the B vitamins, iodine, fatty acids, and others. It's really, there are lots of people out there with deficiencies, and doctors are missing a trick by not actually screening for these. In terms of patients who've had bariatric screening, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence recommend that patients who've had bariatric surgery should be screened every year, every 12 months, for a range of minerals and vitamins. In fact, on this chart, they show that, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse pointer, where it says S, that's where they just recommend patients are given supplements without screening for the test. And that's simply because those tests aren't routinely available on the NHS. But at the VHL, we can offer these tests. But you can see they should be screened for zinc, they should be screened for copper. B12 is fairly conventional. Parathyroid hormone is quite an expensive test to run, but it's recommended. And of course, these are the more conventional tests, but the ones I've circled in red are the ones that we can offer at VHL. In terms of optimal nutritional status for any nutrients, any essential nutrients, if you have a very low level, then ultimately there's poor health and then death occurs. But in a normal individual with relatively healthy levels, you have this optimal range. But the laboratories report lower and upper limits of normal. The lower limit being the point at which below you are defining a deficiency. And if somebody is very close to that low level, they're highly vulnerable to a deficiency where symptoms might start to occur and be evident. And actually, you don't want someone to be that low. You want them to be near an optimal level. So a lot of the testing we do will show suboptimal levels, which we call a subclinical deficiency. And what you should be aiming to do with your patients is to try and get the levels up into an adequate level so they have a reserve. So when there are increased challenges for them, they have an adequate reserve. If somebody, well, go back to zinc, if somebody cuts themselves, they're going to use up quite a lot of zinc in the healing process. If they're right on the borderline level, or God forbid, if they have an accident and end up having major surgery, their zinc level is going to be very, very rapidly depleted during the healing process. So keeping an optimal level gives them that reserve. It's the same with respiratory infections. It will use up some of their zinc reserves. And then at the other extreme, if the level goes too high, you have a subclinical raised level, and higher than that, it becomes toxic, where the function, the performance of the individual, and the enzymes and so forth that depend on that micronutrient start to tail off. They're not functioning optimally. So attaining optimal level is always going to be best for the majority of patients. And that's what we're trying to do by testing so that practitioners can aim to reach those adequate levels. This is a sample of our plasma mineral screen, which is one of the most basic profiles we do for nutritional screening. And we've included in that the key minerals. It's a fairly conventional report with a reference range. So this is a traditional reference range. And as I say, I would, in most cases, practitioners would be encouraged to ranges, so well away from the lower limits of normal, but up halfway in the limits if you possibly can. It's easier said than done for some patients. On this particular profile, it's all plasma minerals we're measuring, except for magnesium. Plasma or serum magnesium level is maintained fairly concisely by normal human physiology because it's such an essential mineral for heart function. Of course, the heart depends enormously on adequate magnesium levels. If the serum magnesium level starts to fall, then magnesium can pass across the cells into circulation. It tops up the serum level. So if you just measure serum magnesium, except in the very acutely ill, it will always be normal. But by measuring the red cell magnesium, so the erythrocyte magnesium here, you're looking at nutritional reserves of magnesium. And this isn't a great example of patients at the upper limit of normal, but we see an enormous number of low and borderline red cell magnesium levels, suggesting the patients don't have a good reserve of magnesium. And that's primarily through dietary choices. It can be through gut function, but we get a lot of our magnesium from eating nuts and seeds and green leafy vegetables, because magnesium is on the chlorophyll atom, the chlorophyll molecule in leafy plants. So the more green leafy vegetables you eat, the more magnesium you get. And we know that in a lot of the population, their intake of green leafy vegetables is pretty small. This is one of our, I think this is our vitamin 16 panel, which is the most comprehensive vitamin profile we offer. It's run by us by the European Laboratory of Nutrients, which provides a very comprehensive vitamin screening service. And they use the latest technology, HPLC and gas chromatography with mass spectrometry. So they're very accurate levels, and they're able to look at the various isomers of vitamins as well. So they're not just looking at the total levels, they look at the individual components of vitamins to give you a better guide as to where the patients have low levels and how you might optimize their diet and supplement program to bring these levels back into the normal ranges. I'm not going to go through that in any detail because, as you can see, there's an enormous amount there. We're very limited on time, but there's a very wide range of vitamins that are screened now. I think there's about 60. Well, yeah, I think there's 16 different vitamins altogether. We, as I briefly mentioned, fatty acid levels are extremely important. They have many influences on health. There are many dietary issues which lead to people having low fatty acid levels or undesirable ratios of fatty acids. As time's gone by, it's become acknowledged that the ratio of different fatty acids to each other it plays a significant part in health. And we offer this profile by Omega Quant, looking at the key fatty acids. It looks at the total levels in each of the groups, so monounsaturated fatty acids, omega-6 fatty acids, omega-3 fatty acids, etc. And includes some trans fatty acids, which are undesirable. And it's a really useful tool. It's actually run by the University of Stirling in Scotland on our behalf, and we have a 4 or 5 day turnaround time on it. So we're providing a very valuable tool with some very advanced biochemistry in it, and we're able to provide really rapid turnaround times, which is fantastic. We do offer allergy and food intolerance tests. Most adults know if they have a food allergy by the time they reach adulthood, but the test can also be used to look for inhalant allergies. So we do a lot of screening for pollen and grass allergies. The test can be run as a food allergy, as an inhalant allergy, or as a combined allergy profile. Of perhaps more interest to nutritional therapists and people interested in micronutrient screening is a food intolerance profile. So this is looking at IgG levels to food. The traditional allergy tests look at IgE levels, where individuals tend to have a fairly rapid response to allergens if they've become sensitized. Whereas in food sensitivity screening, where we look at IgG levels, patients have a much a slower reaction to foods, and that makes it difficult for them to associate their symptoms with particular foods they've consumed the previous day. It becomes very confusing. And years ago, what people used to do was to go on a very restrictive diet and observe if their symptoms decreased, and then gradually start to reintroduce foods and see if symptoms recurred. And what food intolerance screening can do, and it covers, I think this profile covers over 250 different foods. It gives you some idea of if there is an immune response of some kind to various food groups and indeed individual foods, which can help in treating patients by putting them on less restrictive food avoidance diets. So we do it an enormous amount of food intolerance screening. In terms of environmental medicine, so this is exploring the effects of toxic exposures on health and well-being. It is linked to nutritional medicine as well, in that we need the micronutrients to enhance the activity of the enzymes which are involved in the metabolism of toxins, detoxification. But broadly, the toxins we're exposed to in the environment are toxic metals, which I mentioned a little while ago. Includes things like aluminium and fluoride even is a toxic metal. Increased exposure to fluoride is highly toxic. It's not necessarily preventive of dental caries, and there's hugely conflicting literature about the efficacy of using fluoride for dental carie prevention. It's not considered an essential mineral. If you deprive someone completely of fluoride, actually their tooth health doesn't deteriorate, and they don't really experience any symptoms of fluoride deficiency. There are also toxic chemicals, and we're all exposed to thousands of different toxic chemicals in tiny doses on a very regular basis. Pesticides and herbicides and insecticides contaminate our food. Plasticides, these are chemicals in plastics that give them particular properties. cosmetics and personal health products, combustion products. So this is what's produced by the burning of fuels, both in the home and also in vehicles, cleaning products, insect repellents, etc., etc. And at high levels, all of the above are known to be highly toxic. Chronic exposures have some recorded effects, and we know that accumulation does occur with some of these metals and some of these chemicals, but lower levels of exposure lead to some level of accumulation, and they are highly likely to affect the adaptive capacity, which I talked about earlier, and they will place an increased burden on detoxification pathways. So it increases the requirement for micronutrients, and thus the risk of deficiencies. So you can see that toxic exposures have a direct impact on micronutrient status. In terms of toxic elements, we're quite lucky. We have ways of looking at levels which are actually quite reliable. Hair analysis, where you take not just a single hair, but a group of hairs about a tablespoon of hair in total. It's dissolved down in acid and then analysed as a liquid for toxic metals. Can also be screened for minerals. And the beauty of hair is that what you measure, it's a dead sample. The hair isn't living except at the root, but the metals that are circulating in the capillaries in the scalp, the blood in the capillaries in the scalp, are deposited in the hair as it grows. So, and the hair grows very slowly. So if you take 3 or 4 centimeters of hair and analyze that, it will give you an average level of metals that were circulating in the blood at the time the hair grew, which is typically the previous 2 to 3 months. So this is a really nice environmental, a screen of environmental exposure to toxic metals. And it represents metals that are bound to the hair. So it's not external contamination of the hair with metals, but it's reflecting the circulating blood levels. And as we age, our levels of hair toxic metals increase, as do blood and urine levels. People who there's a slightly raised mercury level here. People who consume tinned tuna regularly are likely to push up their mercury levels. People who consume rice from certain parts of the world, including some Kellogg's rice products, have quite high arsenic levels in them, and arsenic can accumulate and will be seen in that hair analysis. Arsenic isn't necessarily as harmful as some of the other toxic metals. But anyway, this is a really nice general screening tool. And as I say, it can be used for minerals as well. You can also measure toxic metals in urine. And I would say that pretty much every patient we screen, we do see some above average levels. So it's a very, very common problem for people to be exposed to and accumulating toxic metals. So that's a urine screen. With urine, rather than just a spot urine, where the levels may fluctuate slightly over the hours and through the day, we actually recommend that patients collect their sample over a 6-hour period and then just send us a mixed aliquot of that. So we get a representative sample over a few meals and through the course of the day. We also offer a urine test for to assess toxic chemical exposures. Now, we're not measuring the chemicals directly because there are hundreds of thousands of them. But this particular profile looks at metabolites of detoxification of certain groups of chemicals. So there's some insecticides and pesticides there. There's a marker of benzene exposure from combustion products, styrene exposure, phthalates exposure. Phthalates are plasticizers and compounds that are used in plastic products. If you walk into a furniture store, there's a very strong smell of chemicals, and that's very often plasticizers and chemicals that are used in not just the production, the materials of the furniture, but they're also, of course, coated with fire retardant chemicals now. So a toxic chemical exposure profile is a really useful way of screening patients for any increased levels of chemicals. And because you're looking at metabolites of chemicals, this represents chemicals they're exposed to at the moment. It's not this isn't historical. This shows ongoing exposures. This is fascinating. Mycotoxins. So these are toxins that are given off by molds, and screening for mycotoxins has been available routinely now for, when I say routinely, within specialist environmental screening labs, for maybe 10 years. And again, we're looking at metabolites of molds, but an enormous number of people do have circulating mycotoxin levels, and it's not just from eating moldy cheese. Lots of the food and veg that we eat have mold, invisible mold on it that we consume. There's mold in many households where the rooms are sealed with double or triple glazing and they're well heated, and yet the sources of damps are kitchens and bathrooms. Mold can grow, and if mold's growing, they will be giving off mycotoxins, and patients will be inhaling these, and they can lead to all sorts of health problems. So this is a fascinating profile, and there is an enormous number of people using it. It's looking for these mycotoxin markers in urine, so it's a nice, easy easy test for patients to provide a sample for. In terms of the gastrointestinal tract, this is a really important aspect of protecting us and helping us in terms of nutrition environment. The gut is the largest surface area that's exposed to the environment. It's much greater than the surface area of the skin because of the structure of the gut and the villi and the microvilli that represent the digestive or the absorptive surface. It's a very important consideration when you're looking at an individual's diet and the effects of the environment on their health. We have a number of tests of gut function. We offer stool testing for bacteria, yeast, and parasites, and I'll show you in a minute. It also has some chemistry markers. We offer a novel breath testing test for assessing bacterial activity in the gut, but primarily in the small intestine, where you wouldn't expect there to be high levels of bacterial activity, and zonulin, which can be a marker of damage to the gut wall, leading to increased permeability. So stool testing, this is I think it's about a 15-page report, but what it does is it looks at the makeup of the gut microbiome, the different types of bacteria in the gut and in the microbiome, and how that varies from normal. And there's enormous amounts of research into the impact of a poor microbiome health. Of course, antibiotics will kill off a lot of naturally occurring bacteria and can affect microbiome health. I've just seen the type, so I need to move on fairly quickly. As I said, the stool profile covers lots of pathogens. It uses PCR technology and also culture and sensitivity, so they provide both pharmaceutical and natural sensitivities as recommended treatments for any pathogens that are found. It includes sufficient inflammatory markers for you to be able to distinguish between inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome. And again, don't hesitate to contact us. We can provide you with more details of these tests. Something that we're specialising in at VHL is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So as I mentioned, in the small intestine, there's normally very low levels of bacteria, but after a gastric infection or after gut surgery, or as the gut ages, people can become more vulnerable to bacteria growing in the small intestine. This causes symptoms which are very similar to those described in irritable bowel syndrome. And it's estimated that about half of patients with IBS actually have small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And this leads to interactions with carbohydrates that they consume. So they feel unwell once they've consumed carbohydrates. The NHS estimates that 13 million individuals in the UK experience IBS on a regular basis, and around 10 million of these probably have SIBO. So we have a lab that's dedicated to breath testing for SIBO. The symptoms are gas, bloating, loss of appetite, abdominal pain, all the sorts of symptoms you'd associate with IBS. And the presence of hydrogen and methane in the breath occurs only when carbohydrates are fermented by bacteria in the gut. So what we do is we ask patients to avoid high fiber diets and starchy foods, any foods that are difficult to digest and that would reach the large bowel, we ask them to avoid for 24 hours. So they have a fairly restricted diet. They fast overnight. Then they provide us with a fasting breath sample, and we have a little device here for collecting samples into a sealed glass tube. It's a very simple procedure. The patients provide us with a fasting breath sample, and then they take a dose of lactulose, which is a non-absorbable carbohydrate, and then they provide another breath sample every 20 minutes for 3 hours. And what we're looking for in those breath samples is to look for an increase in hydrogen and methane, hydrogen or methane production within the first 2 hours of the test period. And that's when the lactulose is in the small intestine. And we plot this as a graph. So on this particular patient, we have, this is time versus gas levels, and this is plotting hydrogen level. After a couple of hours, so around the 120-minute mark onwards, you would normally get an increase in breath hydrogen as the lactulose reaches the microbiome in the large bowel. And there's lots of bacterial fermentation. But if you get a peak before this, and in this patient, it's really from 40 to 60 minutes onwards, there's a very significant peak in the hydrogen in their breath. Pardon me. And that reflects bacterial activity in the small intestine. So that's a positive diagnosis for SIBO. And I've got on the side here our diagnostic criteria for diagnosing SIBO. It can be treated with antibiotics, but also there are herbal antimicrobial compounds which are just effective, and they can be taken for longer and they do less harm to the microbiome. So many practitioners are now using non-pharmaceutical antimicrobial compounds. Vitamin C can be helpful. It's antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral. People can use diets. Low-carb diets will help to reduce the food supply for the bacteria, basically, so that all helps. The test can also be used for lactose and fructose intolerance. If for patients who can't break down these sugars, the sugars would normally be broken down, absorbed across the gut wall into the blood. If they're not, they will then reach the large bowel 2 to 3 hours after consumption, and then we'll see an increase in breath hydrogen and methane at the end of the test period. So we do quite a lot of both lactose and fructose intolerance testing. This is all backed up with really good science. There was an American consensus statement by leading American gastroenterologist a few years ago, and the Europeans have just done the sign a really comprehensive paper supporting the use of this type of SIBO testing by leading gastroenterologists. And again, I can let you have copies of that paper if you're interested. In terms of the sample types we use, I just want to illustrate that a lot of the testing we do is minimally invasive. We do offer venous blood tests for a lot of tests, but equally we're expanding the range of finger prick tests that we offer, and this can either be dried blood spots as shown here, or increasingly we're using the microvials, which are like little blood tubes, and just with a finger prick you collect spots of blood to half or 2/3 fill these microvials. Actually we can measure minerals and toxic metals in hair. We offer saliva screening for hormones and adrenal function. We have some dried urine patches for hormone screening as well, where patients just urinate on one of these absorbent patches, leave it to dry, and then the urine can be extracted from the patch. And with Roseway Labs, we're going to be offering quite a number of our tests as non-invasive sample kits for patients to obtain through Roseway. Our philosophy, I just want to cover this briefly at the end, is that wealth in health that good health improves life satisfaction, and health is considered one of the most important considerations for life satisfaction. If we want to live into old age, we want to be healthy in our old age and not have the last decade ruined by poor health and poor mobility. So enhancing adaptive capacity in earlier years by diet and exercise and avoiding toxins will hopefully help us all to lead a healthier and longer life. And the other thing I haven't really mentioned is that doing nutritional screening is very often a way of looking at the root cause of disease. You're looking at for deficiencies of perhaps minerals and vitamins that enzymes require to function properly. So a lot of medicine is about assisting symptoms and easing symptoms, but very often with nutritional medicine, you can be treating the root cause of disease rather than just treating the symptoms. So that's all I have to say at the moment. If anyone has any questions, I'd be very pleased to take them. Or you can contact me directly at Viva Health Labs if you'd like any further information about anything I've discussed here. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Mark. I think that was very informative information, and I'm sure everyone enjoyed it. I am conscious of the time, so I'd like to reiterate the offer of if you do have any questions, please do feel free to either email Mark directly or send us an email at info@rosewaylabs.com. But we will open the floor, so if anyone has any questions, please do raise your virtual hand now and we'll unmute you to ask.
That's easy.
Oh, there we go. We have a question from Lim, if I'm not mistaken.
Dr. Lim. Hi.
Oh, hi. Great presentation. I sort of came late. I was working, but I very much enjoyed it. You've got a whole range of tests that I can see. Did you call your sort of medicine nutritional medicine, or is it analogous to functional medicine in the States?
Yeah, I call it nutritional and environmental medicine. The Americans call it functional medicine, and that's caught on in the UK. So it's effectively functional medicine. It's looking at the building blocks of health and what leads to disease.
And in terms of your tests, I missed the beginning of your presentation. You're working with Roseway Labs there. Is that how it is, or?
Yes, it is. We're working with Roseway Labs, and Roseway Labs will be providing many of our tests. But we also offer venous blood samples, and we offer a full pathology laboratory service as well. So that can be accessed directly. Obviously, we're working with Roseway Labs tonight, so we'd like you to go through Roseway Labs for anything that they're offering. But we are offering a very comprehensive routine pathology service along with the nutritional environmental medicine test.
Okay, no, that's great. I wonder if it's possible just to have the details of your lab for, for some of my patients who may require the other pathology tests rather than some of the tests that Roseway are offering.
Yes, sure. Yourselves. Well, if you Google Viva Health Labs, you'll find our website, which has all the contact details on.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
That's all right. Thank you.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, this is Elizabeth from Roseway. I just wanted to say as well that, we're very happy, Dr. Lim, if you would like to be introduced into Mark's company, we can just send an email connecting you to the right person. That's not a problem at all.
Okay.
So very happy to do that. I did have one question as well. Great. Yes. We didn't cover this because we looked at nutrition, but I did just wonder. There's been people have been trying finger prick blood tests for hormones, and that's been generally proved to be quite unreliable. Has that been your experience?
No, it's not actually. We've just over the last few weeks been undertaking some fairly comprehensive stability studies of finger prick blood samples for all of the routine biochemistry. And actually, most of the tests have passed quite well. One of the problems with finger pricks is samples can become hemolyzed quite easily. So the failure rate of a finger prick sample is higher than a venous sample. But the majority are perfectly all right. And we found good stability for most of the commonly measured hormones for up to 3 days. We tested for up to 3 days. But equally, non-invasive testing for hormones has proved to be incredibly reliable. Saliva levels correlate really well with blood levels, as do urine levels. And in terms of functional medicine, when people are looking at hormone function, they tend to look at adrenal function as well. So they measure cortisol levels through the day. Patients provide an early morning sample, lunchtime, late afternoon, evening, and nighttime samples, so you can track their cortisol and adrenal function, cortisol levels and adrenal function. It's quite difficult to measure cortisol levels reliably in blood samples because ideally you just they just do an early morning level, but it's interesting to see what happens to cortisol through the day. But as I say, saliva and hormone levels are also have proven to be very reliable ways of looking at endocrine levels.
Thank you, Mark, and a very interesting presentation too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So I think if we don't have any other questions, then all that's left to say is a very big thank you to you, Mark, for your presentation, and to everyone for joining us this evening. A recording of this presentation will be sent to you in the coming days. And as stated earlier, if you have any queries, please don't hesitate to reach out to Roseway or Viva Health Laboratories. So, and have a great evening, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Thanks, everyone.